Dan Lyons, senior college football writer for Athlon Sports, has also been at Sports Illustrated and elsewhere, and he joins us on 365 Sports with Craig and Paul. David Smokey ranked the FBS conferences 1 through 9, and Dan, thank you for your time. I would think everyone would there's always going to be some sort of a debate between 1 and 2, the SEC, Big Ten, and then there's that Big 12 ACC, but you took on all 9. How much of a project was that for you?
It was a bit of a project. Obviously, I was at SEC Media Days and Big Ten Media Days a couple weeks ago, so I was pretty up on those leagues, but I'm still rounding into form as we get into the season here starting this weekend, and then obviously the big week next week. So I did a lot of research on the Sun Belt and the AAC, and had to remember which of those teams are in which leagues now because the whole sport's been upended the last couple of years. So it was a bit of an undertaking, but it was a fun one and a good way to kind of get myself oriented as we get to football here in a couple of days.
The AAC still the fifth best, or still the fifth best conference. Or I guess it would have been the sixth best before, but still up there. Even though a lot of their teams have been harvested, is that because they've done the best harvesting of the other teams from the other leagues?
I think it's a combination. I think they still have the best top tier among. I would say the AAC, the Mountain West, and the Sun Belt are all pretty interchangeable. I went with the AAC at 5 just because of those top teams they have left. UTSA has been very impressive. Memphis is arguably the favorite to make the college football playoff in that group of 5 spot this year. USF took a huge leap last year, has a really explosive offense, and could be a contender for that spot as well. So I just thought the top tier of that league was a little bit better than what the Mountain West and what the Sun Belt brings. But I do think it's a pretty far cry from where we saw the AAC a few years ago when they had Houston and Cincinnati and UCF at a pretty deep league. Now, the bottom half of that league is a little more suspect when you have schools like Charlotte and Temple, which, has not really rebounded after that string of coaching successes it had. So that's dragging it down a bit where it was pretty clearly the next league. And I know Mike Oresco, the former commissioner, loved to call it the Power Six at the time. Now it's far closer to the Mountain West and the Sun Belt at the top of the group of 5, I think.
You've got the Big 12 at number 3 and then the ACC at 4. How tough of a decision was it to break the tie between the two, or to give the leg up to one or the other?
I think that's a pretty close one. I think you could go either way. If you have a vintage Florida State or a vintage Clemson season, you might give the edge to the ACC. They have the more proven national title winners, although it's been a couple of years, especially for Clemson. They're still finding their way in the new transfer portal era, which Dabo has been so reluctant to get involved in. I think the Big 12 just has the more fun group up top, to put it quite frankly. I think the imports from the Pac-12, Utah and Arizona should both be in the mix. Kansas State should have one of its best years in recent memory. Obviously, they won the Big 12 a couple of years ago, but they could be a playoff contender. Utah should step right in and be a playoff contender. So I just thought there was more interesting things happening in the top tier of that league versus the ACC, where you have, Miami could be very good this year, but we've seen this so many times before where they enter with big top 10 aspirations and don't quite get there. And then I think the middle of the league is a bit stronger. The ACC could come through if you have a Georgia Tech and Syracuse step up, but I just trust the middle of the Big 12 a bit more at this point.
What do you think the addition of SMU? I know Cal Stanford also knew, but the SMU doesn't seem like they're wanting to walk through the front door. One thing they'll not want, but walking through the front door and they feel like they can be a player immediately.
Yeah, I think SMU has the highest expectations of the new ACC schools. Stanford's probably going to be towards the bottom of the league, Cal somewhere in the middle. SMU is such an impressive offense. They've really had that program rolling for a few years. They enter with a solid quarterback in Preston Stone. I think it's a really interesting addition. It's one where, SMU was kind of languishing for so long. It isn't like one of those programs that has been at the top of those group of 5 lists for too long, but obviously they have the investment behind it, which was a big deal in getting in the door, and they're very willing to throw their money around and throw their prowess around. So, the ACC it's interesting to see the league get into Texas. Obviously, that's flown a bit under the radar compared to getting into California, which is such a kind of a mind-twisting thing for the ACC. But no, I think SMU's expectations are really high, and they're entering the league at a good time considering what talent they have on the roster. You've seen other schools change leagues and struggle right out the gate, and SMU has a chance to, I don't think they'll compete for the league, but they have a chance to compete to be in the top 5.
Dan Lyons, Athlon Sports with us, covering college football, 365 Sports.
Dan, what do you see as the gap between the SEC and Big Ten, if there is one, in the depth and talent of either league? I mean, obviously you have the SEC ranked number 1. The Big Ten has new teams, that are all, especially Oregon, all really good as well. But do you see the SEC maybe, having a bit of a lead in the race that even the Big Ten, as big as it is going to have to catch up on?
Yeah, I think the difference is with the Big Ten, you have Ohio State and Oregon, who are 2 and 3 in the polls entering the year. They're both major favorites to make the playoff. And then after that, you have to kind of find a story to, like, how does Michigan get back without Harbaugh, without J.J. McCarthy, with basically a whole new offense. Penn State has been on the cusp, but they still have to find, like, more explosiveness on offense, and they've just really struggled to win the big game. And then you get into, like, your Iowas, your USC's, teams that were deeply flawed last year that are – have to really find something on a full side of the ball to become a playoff type caliber team. In the SEC, I think you can talk yourself into like 8 teams being somewhere in the mix. Like even if you get down to Oklahoma or Tennessee, it's not that hard to paint a picture where one of those teams is a playoff team. So I just think you have that depth in like the second tier of team that really sets the SEC apart as number 1, even though I would probably argue that Ohio State is the most talented team in the country this year, and I think Oregon is right locked in there, and wouldn't shock me if they win that league. It's just behind them, you don't have as many teams that seem like legitimate, potential national title teams, whereas the SEC, there are lots of questions, but I think at least half the league is somewhere where, things break right, guys come along and really max out their potential, and you have potential playoff teams there.
How often did you have to go and look to make sure who was in what conference at this point?
Oh, it wasn't so bad in the Power 4, and I keep on calling it the Power 5. That's going to take a while. It is really the AAC, the Sun Belt, and Conference USA is just a mess. It's all those leagues overlap geographically. It's really all over the place. So I think that's going to be kind of an ongoing process. But I've gotten better at it in going through the exercise of making this article. So I'm happy to have that experience now.
So your thoughts, you've seen the AP and the coaches poll that's come out, and obviously most everybody that I think if we would have all had our top 10 would have been in that area, 10 through maybe 12 or so. Anybody in your opinion that's a little, I used this term yesterday, that's a little over-modulated, and is there a program or two you feel like that might or should be getting a little bit more attention?
Yeah, over-modulated is a fun one. Florida State, I just have a lot of questions about. They were a great team last year. Obviously, their exclusion from the playoff was basically defining the end of the season until we got into Michigan winning the national championship. I do think they're getting a little bit inflated coming off of the success of last season. I am not a huge believer in DJ Uiagalelei. He obviously made progress at Oregon State after being fairly disappointing at Clemson. I think they'll be a good team. I don't know that they'll be a top 10 team, and that is where they're slotted in, at least in the AP poll, they're number 10. In terms of underrated teams, Kansas State, I think just they're just such a solid program. Chris Kleiman has them really rolling. A lot of it will come down to whether Avery Johnson is really going to be at least match, if not take a step forward from what Will Howard gave them last year. But obviously the noise coming out of Manhattan has been that he is an incredibly dynamic quarterback. So that gives them really another dimension if they kind of take that offense to the next level.
What are your thoughts with the college football 12 about how everything breaks down? Obviously, the group of 5, the best, highest rate conference champion is in. It gives them an opportunity. That's all you can hope for. And the question is how many of the other conferences get the remaining at large? Do you feel like most of those, or maybe even all of them, will go to the SEC and Big Ten?
Yeah, I think it'll be the vast majority. I would be surprised if it was less than like 8 between those two leagues. It's just, there's such a depth of talent atop those two leagues. If you look at the AP poll, 15 of the top preseason top 25 are from those two leagues. And obviously that doesn't really dictate what happens once we get to November. But I just think you're given a lot of opportunity for big wins. At the same time, you can see teams kind of cannibalize each other, which is a concern, I would say. But we've seen the voters in previous years really lend credence to teams from those big conferences, and also kind of ignore some of the scrappy teams from the group of fives, or even, startups in the ACC. So it'll be fascinating to see, but I would be very surprised if this wasn't largely an SEC and Big Ten invitational, and we have a couple other teams trying to sneak their way through.
Dan Lyons with his Athlons with us on 365 Sports.
How much of the SEC's prowess is earned, and how much of it is also because of the marketing that they've done, which is better than anybody?
It is definitely better than anybody. I will say it is largely earned. There have been years where you have like the third or fourth SEC team really doesn't look that impressive, but entering this season, we saw Texas go to the college football playoff last year. Alabama obviously will have questions about Nick Saban, but I think everyone is fairly confident about Kalen DeBoer, given his background and given what they have returning. And then, Ole Miss, which is right behind them in the AP poll, they had a great season last year, arguably the best season in probably since the 50s for that program. So this year specifically, I think a lot of it has been earned on the field, and we're entering with a lot of information about these teams. That doesn't mean that there won't be some years where the SEC winds up getting, 6 teams in the playoff when really they should have had 4. But this year would not surprise me if things are really tilted that way, just because of all the returning talent, all the quarterback talent, and just the stacked rosters that some of these coaches have built with the transfer portal and everything else.
We have games starting this weekend, Dan. How much just, I think, emotional health in a way that we actually have games and then results, and then we can break all that down, and not everything is about realignment or everything else. That's always there, but how much fun just the fact that there are games about to start.
I'm so excited. I think it's really starting to hit me this week. Just even Florida State, Georgia Tech, like that's not the flashiest game. Georgia Tech's unranked, but that team made progress last year. Florida State has questions. Like that could be a fun game out in Ireland, and we saw a pretty fun atmosphere there. Was it a year or two ago with Northwestern? I think it was Northwestern, and I forget what Big Ten opponent they had, but the fans in Europe clearly got up for that one. I think this should be a really interesting one. It's a noon kickoff, so we can all kind of get into game form. The rest of week 0 isn't that exciting. SMU, as we mentioned before, will be playing against Nevada, but it's actually a little taste. And then week 1 is pretty loaded this year.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Good stuff with the ranking of the FBS conferences. Good luck with what you're doing with Athlons, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Dan Lyons with his Athlon Sports on the ranking of the FBS. And